This happened over a decade ago. Close to 15 years ago, actually. I was just a 14-year-old boy living in a small town with my parents. It was a really close-knit farming community in the Midwest of the United States. The only thing that really put our town on the map was that it had the only train station in the area. Because of that, we would occasionally see outsiders wandering around the streets. They would never stay long though. Other than that, everyone knew each other. My friends and I loved to hang out in the schoolyard late at night during the summer months. There wasn't really anywhere else for us to go. There was no arcade, no skate park, and we were too cheap to see a movie at the small theater in town. That's not a great way to socialize anyway. In the winter months, alcohol was a bigger part of our lives, but this took place in the summer. It was a warm July evening, probably close to midnight, and we were sitting on the swings in the schoolyard. The moon was full, and it cast a mild light on everything. We were just talking about nonsense, sharing a cigarette that my friend Zach stole from his dad. As time went on, a thick sheet of clouds covered the moon, and it went dark. When the moon reappeared, a man came out of nowhere. He was walking towards us. He looked to be in his late 40s, with shaggy brown hair and a short beard that was mostly gray. He wore a dirty white t-shirt and torn jeans. We knew right away that he wasn't from our town, because we would have known him if he was. This guy must have been passing through, and that made us really scared.
"Hey kids, what are you doing out here so late?"
he asked in an interrogating tone. We all exchanged glances, a little unnerved by the stranger's sudden appearance, but we didn't want to be rude, so we answered politely. "Just hanging out, sir," I said. The man smiled, and I noticed his teeth were yellow and crooked.
"That's cool,"
he said, trying to sound like he was much younger than he was. We went back and forth for a while. He was asking us all kinds of questions, and we were answering with a single word most of the time. It must have been pretty obvious that we were uncomfortable. We really wanted him to leave, but none of us said it directly. After 5 minutes or so, the man said that he had something cool to show us, and asked us to follow him. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I saw the same fear in my friend's eyes. We knew this was not right, and we knew we had to get out of there. "No thank you," I said firmly. "We have to go home now." But the man wasn't satisfied. He took a step forward.
"Come on, don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. I just want to show you something."
That's when I saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. I realized with horror that he was holding a knife. "Run," I shouted to my friends, and we all took off in different directions. I ran as fast as I could, faster than I thought possible. I didn't look back, so I don't know which one of us, if any, he was chasing. I was afraid for my life, so I just kept running. But then, I saw the lights of my house in the distance. I kept running, and I burst in the front door, grasping for breath. My parents were already in bed, so I ran up the stairs and woke them up. "Jason, what's wrong?" my mom asked, concern etched on her face. I was so out of breath that I couldn't even speak. But eventually, I managed to blurt out the whole story. My parents listened, their faces turning pale. "We have to call the police," my dad said, reaching for the phone. Within minutes, the police arrived. One of my friends had already called, and they were at his place. Me and my friends gave them a description of the man. They searched the schoolyard and the surrounding area, but they couldn't find him. Our best guess was that he was hiding in the woods on the south side of town, which is not far from the school. It was really big news for a while. For months afterwards, the whole community was on edge. Everyone was locking their doors, and most kids had to be home before dark. The police searched for a while, but they never found the man. Rumor has it that they found a spot in the woods that looked like it had been used as a campsite. There was an old tent and piles of trash, just food wrappers and beer cans, we heard. I think that's probably where the guy was staying, probably where he was going to bring us. This happened about 8 years ago. I was 17 years old, living in the suburbs of a small city with my mom, dad, and little sister. I also had a best friend named Ryan, who lived just a 5-minute walk away from me. We spent most of our free time in the woods surrounding our neighborhood, exploring and just hanging out. There wasn't a whole lot to do where we come from other than that. One night, Ryan and some of our other friends had a fire in our friend Tammy's backyard. She lived on a small farm not far away. It was late, probably 11 p.m., when me and Ryan decided to head back home. It was about a 45-minute walk. We were on a dirt road leading back to our area. The forest was on our right, but it was faster to take the road, even though we knew the trails in the forest really well. While we were walking, a car suddenly pulled up behind us. We saw the headlights from quite a distance away, but we thought it would just drive on by. It was an old beat-up car, and I remember feeling creeped out when the driver rolled down his window. He asked us for directions for a town called Havebrook. Ryan and I looked at each other. Neither of us had ever heard of the town. We had lived there for our whole lives, and if it was anywhere nearby, we would know. Maybe he was more lost than he realized. We didn't know, but we told the guy that we had never heard of the town. As we started to walk away, the car pulled up beside us and drove slowly. He leaned over and offered us a ride. We declined politely, but he persisted. He kept asking and we kept saying no. We started walking faster, but he kept following. It was an awkward couple of minutes with us walking, but trying not to look at the guy. Eventually, I couldn't resist. I turned my head in his direction. As soon as I made eye contact with the man, I felt really scared. Ryan and I both broke into a run, but the car sped up, following us on the dirt path. We were running for our lives now, unsure what the guy wanted from us. We knew we had to lose him somehow, so we ran as fast as we could into the woods. I thought that would be enough to lose him, but when I looked back, I saw the car parked on the side of the road. There was a dark silhouette of the man chasing us into the forest. We were pretty much crying at this point. Neither of us knew what that guy wanted, and we had no idea what he would do if he caught us. He must have been some kind of a murderer or something, I thought. There was no other explanation. After a few minutes, we were out of breath, so we hid behind a large tree to rest. We crouched there, watching the trail that we had been following. The man stomped closer to us and stopped 30 or 40 feet up the trail from us. We peeked over. There was just enough moonlight seeping through the trees that we could see the man. He looked around, panting. Ryan and I were almost holding our breath to avoid making any noise. After a few minutes, the guy finally turned around and went back in the opposite direction. We waited another few minutes and then came out and made our way back home through the forest. We were both shaken up by the incident, and we immediately told our parents what happened. We reported it to the police, and although they searched, the man was never found. I live in Cincinnati, but I grew up in Washington, which is where my parents still live. I have to travel back a few times each year to see my parents for holidays and things like that. My cousin Susan also lives in Cincinnati and makes the same trip, so we always go together. I have a car, so she comes with me and chips in a bit for gas. This incident took place last year, before the Thanksgiving break. We had been driving for a few hours, stopping only for gas and snacks. As we drove along the highway, we spotted a sign for a small town just off the next exit. We were ready to get some real food, so we decided to check it out. We pulled into the parking lot of the only restaurant in the town. The place was a small rundown diner with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered on and off. Inside, the walls were covered with yellowish pictures and old newspaper clippings. The smell of fried food and stale coffee filled the air. It wasn't exactly a 5-star restaurant, but we were hungry, and it was the only place around. We took a seat at a booth by the window and scanned the menu. The waitress, a middle-aged woman, came over and took our order. I ordered a burger and fries, while Susan went for the grilled cheese sandwich. As we waited for our food, I couldn't help but people watch. The diner was surprisingly busy for such a small town. There were truckers and locals filling up the booths and the counter. There was a group of old men at a table in the corner, playing cards, and a young couple with a baby was sitting in a booth by the door, trying to keep the child from crying. Just when our food arrived, the door to the diner burst open, and a man rushed in. He was wearing dark clothes, with a mask and a hood. He looked like bad news. I watched him make his way to the counter. When he got there, he shouted for the money from the register. I slumped down in my seat, still watching him. The waitress behind the counter trembled as she fumbled with the register. Her hands were seriously shaking. That was when I noticed that the man was holding a gun. Susan and I looked at each other. We were both terrified. The other patrons in the diner were stunned as well. The waitress handed a wad of cash to the man. I couldn't tell how much it was. He swiped it out of her hands and ran out the door. He was gone as fast as he came in. Seconds later, we heard police sirens. They were close already. I looked out the window behind me and saw the robber was being arrested right in the street. We stayed and spoke to the officers for a while, but they let us go because there were so many other witnesses. As we left the diner and got back into my car, we were both shaken up. We drove in silence for a while, the events of the past hour still fresh in our minds. The rest of the trip seemed to blur by after that incident. I dropped Susan off at my aunt and uncle's house, but I didn't come in. All I wanted was to get home and go to bed. I eventually told my parents what happened, but they had already heard it from Susan and her parents. It was a scary thing that happened to us that day, but we weren't hurt, and we came out with a crazy story to tell. This happened to me and my sister when we were kids. My family and I would spend a week every year at my uncle's cottage. It was a perfect place for a summer getaway, and we were always excited to go there. It was right on Lake Huron, but there was a white sand beach that could almost pass for somewhere in the Caribbean. Not quite, but almost. The cottage was cozy and rustic. It had almost a log cabin feel, and it smelled like pine trees. There was a wood stove that we used for heat, even though there was electricity as well. We spent our evenings playing board games and telling stories in front of the fireplace. On our second day there, my sister Julie and I decided to go for a walk on the beach. Our uncle had a metal detector, and we would use it to search for treasure. All we would find most of the time were bottle caps. We made a game out of collecting as many different kinds as possible though, and it was kind of fun. The sun was shining, and the water was sparkling in the distance. We strolled along the shore, talking about nothing in particular. Eventually, we wandered off into a part of the beach where we had never been before. We had to walk through some tall grass to get there. As we were walking, the metal detector went off. It was something big. I dug it up and found something. It looked like a toy gun, but it was heavy, really heavy. Julie looked at it and immediately thought it was real. I don't know how she knew. She was only a year older than me, and definitely didn't have any real experience with guns, but maybe she was just more cautious. She told me to put it down, and we went to tell our parents. My mom and dad were sitting on the porch of the cottage when we approached them. We told them what we had found and where it was. They thought it was probably fake at first, but my dad went to check it out anyway. When he came back, he called the police. My dad thought it was real too. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived, and 2 officers got out. They went to the gun and examined it. They took it with them and disappeared. We later found out that the gun had been used in a robbery several months earlier, where someone had been shot. Luckily he survived, but the gun was a key piece of evidence. After that incident, We were all a bit scared. For a while after that, my parents didn't let us explore with the metal detector alone, but eventually, things went back to normal. It was 1996 in a small urban town on the outskirts of South Manchester in the UK. I was at a small shopping centre surrounded by derelict Victorian cotton mills. It was a very poor town. With that brief description out of the way, it was late September. In the town centre, there was, and still is, an area that we called the Bear Pit. It resembled a very tiny coliseum. Many shoppers used to sit there on the circular steps. In the center was a small pedestal where a regular homeless guy used to beg, sleep, and sit there talking to himself. He was a harmless chap, yet very smelly. This particular September in 1996, my mom and I sat on these steps, eating a pastry from the local bakery. While we sat there, we tried to decide which shops to visit next. We overheard a few others talking about how this guy, or tramp as most referred to him, had been asleep there for hours. My mom and I went and looked around at the shops for a while, then we decided to sit on the bare steps for a while before getting the bus home. After a short amount of time, we saw some magpies landing on the guy and then flying off. My mom said to me, "Do you think he's okay?" But we didn't want to check because he smelled so bad. I think that's the reason nobody else wanted to check either. Within a few minutes, many more magpies landed on him and started pecking at his face, literally taking out pieces of flesh from him. There must have been around 20 other people sitting there on those circular steps, and they all started shouting and screaming in horror. A few of us braved it and went to look at the guy. The poor man had barely any face left. He'd been pecked away by the birds, or so it seemed, because his face was not pointed directly at us. Nobody had mobile phones back then, so the only thing we could do was look for our local policeman. There used to be many patrolling around back then. Once a policeman turned up and saw this poor dead man, he vomited and radioed through to the necessary people. It was a horrific sight. We all left very disturbed, and both my mom and I have never viewed magpies the same way. I'm not sure if I articulated this story very well, but it is true, and it stayed with me all these years. I was only 13 years old back then. If you ever see a magpie land on someone you assume is asleep, they're not asleep. This happened in the late 90s when I was 10 years old. I grew up in a small town in America. That's as much detail as I'm going to give about the actual location. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on, and nobody worried about it. Crime was incredibly rare. In fact, I don't think there was so much as a break-in. The closest thing to crime would have been occasional mischief from the older kids, maybe some vandalism, but that was really it. However, there was one event that shook our little town to its core, and it's something I'll never forget. There was a couple who lived next door to us. They were in their mid-40s and had no kids. They kept to themselves mostly, but they were always friendly when we saw them outside. They had a dog named Marty who would sometimes come over to our yard and play with our dog, and we would chat with the couple while the dogs played. I wouldn't say they were good friends with my parents or me, but we definitely knew them. One day, we noticed that we hadn't seen the couple, or Marty, for a few days. At first we didn't think much of it. Maybe they had gone on vacation or something. Usually we would know when people were away though, so it was weird. As the days went on, my parents became more concerned. It was not normal to go that long without seeing them. Eventually, the police got involved and started investigating. They searched the couple's house and found Marty alone. I heard he was thin and dehydrated, but otherwise he was fine. Their cars were still in the driveway, and there was no sign of forced entry. Police questioned neighbors, friends, and family members, but no one had any information about where the couple could be. As the investigation dragged on, rumors started to circulate around town. Some people speculated that the couple had run away together. Others thought they might have been involved in some kind of criminal activity and had fled to avoid being caught. But nobody knows for sure. Some of my friends had really wild ideas, like that they were abducted by aliens, or that they were aliens. I never believed any of that, though. For me and my family, the whole thing was terrifying. We had always felt safe in our little town, but the disappearance of our neighbors made us realize that anything can happen anywhere. My parents started locking the doors at night, and I became more wary of strangers. Years went by, and the case remained unsolved. The couple's house sat empty and abandoned for years, a constant reminder of what happened. Marty was eventually adopted by another family just down the street, and he came to visit us like before. As I grew up and moved away from my hometown, I never forgot about the couple who had disappeared. Every once in a while, I would do a Google search to see if there had been any updates on the case, but there never were. My parents still live in that house, although they're planning on downsizing. I still visit at least a few times per year, and whenever I pass that house, I feel creeped. I still have no idea what happened, or if anyone in town was involved. For all I know, it could have been anyone. One of my teachers, a friend's parent, or uncle. I really don't know. It made me question everything, and it's still terrifying to this day. I'm a 39-year-old female, and this was back when I was 22. I'm from a small town on Long Island. I was always told by my parents growing up to never get in a car or go anywhere with strangers. I was riding with my brother Michael in a not-so-nice part of town. We stopped at a gas station. I got out to have a cigarette, and he went in to pay for the gas. My brother locked the doors, I guess out of habit. I was standing beside the car because I didn't want to smoke in his car. A man that was older, maybe somewhere in his 40s, was next to his car. He asked me if I could help him with something. I asked what. He said,
Can you put your foot on the gas? I'm having trouble with something, and I want to see something.
I immediately got a bad vibe. My gut said no. I was unsure of what to say, so I said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't feel comfortable." I then tried to open my brother's car door so I could see if I could get in. I then realized that the car was locked. I've never felt so unsafe in my entire life. It was just a bad feeling. I was so freaked out and looking around for my brother when another man walked up to him and said, "I'll help you." I watched as he got into the man's car and put his foot on the gas. I heard him say, "There's nothing wrong with your car." I right away started to freak out. This whole time, I was waiting for my bro to come out of that gas station. It felt like hours. I should have just went in and got him. It would have made sense, but I was kind of frozen in place at this point. After that man tried his gas and nothing was wrong with his car, it seemed to be a setup. The man who owned the car tried to act confused because the whole scene was super shady. When my brother came out, I couldn't have been more happy to see him. I told him what happened, and he said, "Smart. I'm glad you didn't do anything you'd probably regret later." Then he said it sounded like I was almost kidnapped. I felt so uneasy for the rest of the night. I didn't see any reason to go to the police because nothing actually happened, and luckily I wasn't harmed. I did mull it over in my head about what would have happened if he grabbed me. I'm a small petite female, 5'2" and 110 pounds. You really gotta have guts to do that though, and just not care with all the bystanders around. However, Long Island at the time wasn't the type of place where people saved each other. They at most would have taken a license plate number and called the police. This was 2006, so not everyone had cell phones either like today. Although most people did, I still had a flip phone. Even if someone did report it and something did happen, it may be too late. Trafficking is real. I'm just glad I was okay and unharmed. This happened a long time ago. I was 16 years old, and it was the summer before 10th grade. It was the year 2008. I grew up in the country. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and it was only a few thousand people. That's where most of my friends lived. There wasn't even a high school there. They bussed us out to a slightly larger town for that. It was a real hassle, and we never got along with the kids from the larger town. So we were happy when it was summer vacation. That way we could keep to ourselves. Like I said, we didn't like to leave our area, so my friends and I would often go camping in the woods that surrounded our town. We had been going there with our parents since we were really young, but as we got older, it was one of our favorite things to do. On this occasion, I went with my two friends Tyler and Russ, who were brothers. I brought my own tent, but Tyler and Russ shared one. We packed our bags and headed out early in the morning. We knew the woods well, so we didn't need a map or a guide. We just wanted to spend some time away from home and have some fun. We hiked for a few hours until we found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by trees. This was a spot we'd used before. We weren't exactly discovering anything new, just out for a bit of fun. We started a fire and set up our tents. We had brought plenty of food and snacks, and we were excited to spend the night eating s'mores and telling ghost stories. We had also brought a few firecrackers to mess around with. You're not supposed to use them in the area because of forest fires, but we were always careful. As the night wore on, we heard some strange noises in the distance. We shrugged it off as just the sound of the woods, but then we heard footsteps coming closer to our campsite. We all tensed up and turned our faces in the direction of the noise. Suddenly, a man emerged from the darkness. He was tall, with deep inset eyes and a ragged coat. He looked like he hadn't showered in a long time. He approached us and introduced himself as Frank. We were all taken aback, but we didn't want to be rude. We offered him some food and a place to sit by the fire, but we were really hoping he would leave. We chatted for a while, and he seemed fine, but as the night wore on, he started to get too comfortable. He kept asking us questions about our family and where we lived. It started to feel like an interrogation. At one point, I refused to answer one of his questions, and he got pretty upset with me. It was quite jarring. We tried to brush it off and keep the conversation light, and eventually he took off. We were all really uncomfortable, though. We spoke quietly for the rest of the night. I was scared that he was still lurking around and listening to us, and that if we said anything, he might get angry. After an hour, we calmed down. I figured he was far away by then. Who has the patience to wait silently in the woods for an hour just to scare some kids? We went to bed at around 1 a.m. I went to my tent, a small single-person tent, and Tyler and Russ went to their tent, which was big enough for at least 5 people. Not long after I laid down, maybe 20 minutes after, I heard footsteps around the campsite. I thought it was just one of my friends getting up to go to the bathroom. I was a little paranoid though, so I poked my head out. I didn't see anything at first. My tent's door was facing the fire pit, and the other tent was in the opposite direction. I almost gave up and went back to sleep, but I was a little too curious. I got out of my tent and crouched down behind it. Then I slowly peeked my head over the top of my tiny tent. I could see Tyler and Russ's tent now, and there was someone standing next to it. It was Frank from before. It was dark, but his outline was unmistakable. I couldn't tell if he saw me or not, or even which direction he was facing, but I knew it was him. Tyler and Russ were way shorter. He started moving closer to their tent, and I heard him unzipping the door. I could hear movement from within the tent. Then Russ said, "What's up, dude?" I figured he thought it was me opening the zipper, and I shouted, "It's not me. Get your gun." None of us had a gun, unfortunately, but I thought it would be enough to scare the guy off. I was right. The man bolted into the woods as soon as I said that. Tyler and Russ came out. Russ had his flashlight. We looked around for a while, and it seemed the man was gone. We then blew off a few firecrackers, hoping he would think the sound was a gunshot. We were careful not to say anything about the pretend gun, just in case he was listening. We sat up for the rest of the night together, but the man never came back. In the morning, we hiked out and went home to tell our parents. The police got involved, but the man was never found. We kept camping in the woods for years afterwards, and we never had a problem like that again. To this day, I don't know who that guy was or what he was going to do to us. I've heard stories of doppelgangers and glitches in the Matrix before, and I've always been fascinated by them. After hearing these stories, I wondered why more of those things didn't happen to me, but little did I know, a few weeks later, a doppelganger event, or a shift in time, would happen to me. Here's a bit of context about myself and where I live. I live in a small English village in the countryside. It's the kind of place where you don't see many new people. After living there all my life, I see the same regular people going about their lives on a daily basis. I'm a 20-year-old guy, tall with broad shoulders and brown hair. I walked from my house just on the edge of the village to a local shop to get some groceries. It was midday, and the weather was quite dull and gloomy. Everything was going normal until I walked back from the shop. I was walking on the path outside an old church. I carried on walking down the path ahead of me, but I had the option to cross the road and walk on the other side that leads to the same route. I was going there, but just in a different way. As I thought about crossing over, I looked into the distance not too far away from me, and on the other side of the path, I saw me. This person was the same height and build as me, and was wearing the same clothes as me. I was wearing a green wax coat, black trousers, and so was the guy ahead of me on the road. He also had the same brown hairstyle as me. My mind was racing about what could be happening. I then noticed that the guy ahead of me was carrying the same shopping bag as well. I was then surprised to see this person, who looked just like me, waving at an old woman. She was walking the same path as I was, but she was ahead of me and opposite to the other me. I walked past the old woman, and then decided to cross the road to follow the other me. But as I was about to do it, a black car drove in front of me, blocking my view. I decided not to go the same way as the other me, because I had a weird feeling that I shouldn't. I made the decision not to go that way, and at that moment, the guy that looked like me disappeared. He just vanished as soon as I decided not to go the way he was walking. I didn't see him disappear. It was like he was never there at all, but I still had a vivid memory of the event. It was like by suddenly deciding not to go that way, I changed time. I moved quickly ahead to see where he was, but this other me was nowhere to be found. I looked in the driveways of some of the houses, and he was not there either. There was nowhere for him to go, so my mind was blown. As I walked back, I had the most eerie feeling, and I got quite creeped out. I think I had a time slip, and was seeing into the possible future, but by changing my mind and not going that way, it never happened, so the other me in front disappeared. But the other thing that I could not figure out was who that old woman was waving at. I don't know her, and I walked past her, but when I did, she did not seem surprised or shocked that she had seen two of me. Who she was is still a mystery. About 10 years ago, I went to visit my uncle who lived in a small town in a different state. I lived in Connecticut at the time, and I was 18 years old. It was the summer after I finished high school. His town was a nice place. I grew up in the city, and although I enjoyed a lot of things about that, I also liked my uncle's place. I was looking forward to the trip for a long time. My uncle still had to go to work during the day, leaving me with some free time to explore the area on my own. We would spend the evenings hanging out and doing stuff together. We even went camping on the weekend. This story happened on a weekday afternoon though, while my uncle was at work. I had some spare time on my hands and decided to take a stroll in a local park. I didn't have any friends there, so I went alone. It was a pretty decent park with a lot of trees and a man-made lake in the center. There was also a water slide, but it was always closed for some reason. I think they didn't have the money to hire someone to work there. The park was usually filled with families enjoying picnics and children playing, but on that day, it seemed unusually deserted. There was just me and maybe 10 other people if I had to guess. I walked around on some of the trails and paths that went through the park. There was one path that went through a forested area. I had gone back and forth there a few times already. When I came out, I saw an unfamiliar man. He was around 50 years old, with glasses, and a tucked-in golf shirt with black pants. I felt a little weird, sensing something was not quite right. I didn't know why at the time, though. I kept walking, but the man caught up to me and tried to start a conversation. He smiled creepily, his teeth yellowed and crooked. After a minute or two, he asked me to follow him back into the woods. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he wanted to show me something. Alarm bells rang in my head, warning me to stay away. Instinctively, I knew I had to get away from this man. I quickly made an excuse and tried to walk away, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was really strong. I wasn't expecting it. I was a pretty skinny guy back then, and I really couldn't defend myself. Just then, an older couple walked by and noticed me. I looked at them. They stopped in their tracks and looked back. Then I looked at the man who was holding my arm. Neither of us spoke, but he surely knew that I was about to scream, because he let me go. Then he turned around and walked in the opposite direction. I hurried back to my uncle's house. I was shaking the whole way. When I arrived, my uncle was not home from work yet. I waited in the living room until he came back. When he did, I told him about the encounter and described the man. He took a deep breath and told me that he knew who the man was. Apparently others had problems with this guy in the past. He was known in the community for being a creep. Nobody knew the extent of it, though. What he tried to do to me was worse than my uncle thought. It was a small town, so word traveled fast. My uncle told me not to worry about it. I was set to leave in 2 days anyway, and I didn't see the man again in that time. As the years went on, I continued to visit my uncle at least once per year, but never saw that man again. A few years went by before I asked my uncle about it. When I did, his answer was short and vague. Something like, "Don't worry about it. It's been taken care of." I was too nervous to pursue it further. It was a really ominous answer. I was pretty uneasy because of his tone as well. I wonder if they got the police involved, or maybe ran the guy out of town. I also thought that maybe my uncle did something to the guy. He's fiercely protective of his family, and I know he was really angry when I told him what happened. Realistically, I don't think my uncle would do anything that crazy, but something did happen to that guy, and I never saw him again. I'm a 45-year-old male who lives in a small rural community in Wyoming. I believe there are only about 6,000 people in my community. You would never imagine in a town as small as this that anyone would have to worry about having a stalker, or at least I didn't think so. That was until, much to my horror, I discovered that I had one. Let me preface this by saying, until I became a published author in 2013, I was just another friendly face in the crowd. Granted, I'm well known in my community because I work at the hospital and have for many years. At the time, I was working as a training coordinator for the front office staff for our medical clinic as well as the hospital. Getting my first book published generated a great deal of press in my hometown and statewide. The fact that I quickly rose to a 5-star rating on Amazon only generated more press and interviews, therefore more attention. When my second book came out in 2015, all of a sudden, I was like a local celebrity. Being somewhat humble, I was appreciative that the public helped me to sell a lot of books, but I was also uncomfortable with all the attention. Local folks would come to the hospital just to have me sign their books. This is where my stalker story begins. On this particular day, I was up in our medical office building. I was training a new hire, when a rather large biker dude approached the front counter where I was standing. He had long, stringy blonde hair and was covered in tattoos. I smiled and greeted him with a warm hello and asked him if I could help him. I was under the impression that he was there to check in for an appointment. He smiled and admitted he didn't have an appointment that day, but was wondering if I would autograph one of his copies of my book. Not wanting to be rude, I said I would be more than happy and had him follow me down to the end of the counter so I would not be in anybody else's way. To be honest, I was a bit surprised he brought them, considering they were gay-themed supernatural thrillers. I guess he just didn't strike me as the type of guy that would read anything that was gay-themed. Regardless, I thanked him for purchasing the books and signed them for him. He thanked me and left, and I didn't give it any more thought. A few weeks later, he showed up at the hospital where I was again, at the front desk. I was doing some training duties, and he asked me to sign a few more books that he had purchased for a friend. I again thanked him and signed the books. Fast forward to a few months later, and I was filling in for the receptionist at one of our clinics in the small town, about 30 miles away from my hometown. The receptionist scheduled to work that day called in sick, and I agreed to fill in for her. It was shortly after lunch. Guess who walked in, with both my books in hand? None other than Mr. Biker. Being at work, I remained polite and again signed his books, and then he was on his way. Feeling truly creeped out, I spoke to the nurse on duty and expressed my concerns. They dismissed it as nothing other than an obvious fan who must have had a little crush on me, and nothing more. I figured they were probably right and went about my day. The weeks went by, and I began to notice a large guy hanging out in front of my house in the back alley behind it. He always wore a hoodie, and so I couldn't see who he was. I pointed this out to my husband, who reminded me that since our house was up for sale, it was probably just somebody interested in buying it. Then one day, my mother, who lives right across the street from me, called me while I was out of town on a book tour. She told me some strange guy in a hoodie was chasing my house and peering in the windows. I told her it was probably a potential buyer and not to worry about it. Fast forward another few months. I was back at the medical office building in our urgent care center. I was training another new hire when I got a call from one of the girls in central scheduling. She told me she had a guy on the line who kept calling, asking for me, but he refused to identify himself or say why he needed to speak to me. Thinking it was a patient that had an issue of a more sensitive nature, I told her to go ahead and patch him through. Introducing myself, I asked how I could help. I quickly discovered that he was not needing an appointment, nor did he have any medical concerns. He wanted me to know that he was thinking of me, and began to tell me all the sick and twisted things he was going to do to me if he ever got me alone. I was thinking, what's wrong with this guy? I was flipping out by this point, but somehow I still managed to keep my voice calm, and informed that pervert never to call me again, otherwise I would notify the police. Unbeknownst to me, the clinic manager was standing behind me and asked me what was going on. I explained the phone call and what the creep said. The manager felt we needed to notify the police immediately. I met with a few officers and explained what happened. They asked me if I might know this person, and at the time I had no clue who it was. The next morning, I received a call from a local detective who asked me if I would stop by his office before I went to work. He said he had more information on the guy who called me the day before. I agreed to meet him and called the clinic manager to let him know what was going on. I said I would be in as soon as I was done talking with the detective. Upon reaching his office, I was invited in, and the detective got up from his desk and shut the door. He informed me that they did a search on the number that the guy called from, and came up with some rather disturbing information. He went on to explain that after learning who the guy was, the detective had done some digging, including interviewing some folks this guy associates with. What the detective told me next made all the hair on my body stand on end and sent my heart crashing to the floor. I was informed that this guy had been watching and stalking me for over 6 months. Not only that, he believed that the guy had been in my house. I was shaking from fear and finding it hard to breathe. I began to pace the floor in his rather small office. I explained I didn't have a clue who this guy was or what he looks like. That's when the detective turned his computer monitor towards me and showed me who he was. It was the biker dude. My blood ran cold, and I felt like I was going to pass out. When I could collect myself, I began to explain how he had been in my yard, the front and back. He had been sitting in front of my house on the street. I also told him I had seen him walking up and down the alley between my mother's house and mine. The detective informed me that this guy was a well-known gang member and drug dealer from California, and he'd been living in my hometown dealing drugs there for a year. He told me that I needed to make sure all my doors and windows were locked at all times, and to always have somebody walk me to my vehicle and never go anywhere alone. He said this guy had been accused of killing witnesses in previous drug offenses, and that's why he's still on the street. Then, much to my surprise and horror, the detective asked me if I would be willing to befriend this guy to help the cops set up a drug sting operation. I was mortified and angry, to say the least. I told him I needed time to absorb all this, and I'd get back to him. My manager and the CEO of the hospital met with me when I got to work, and I told them everything. An organization-wide email went out with the guy's picture, along with an alert asking that the CEO, clinic manager, and I be notified if that creep was spotted on any of the facilities. We were a small hospital, so to speak, so we had no security. 2 weeks went by, and things seemed to calm down. My husband and I had gone out for the evening and reminded our roommate that if he left the house, to be sure to lock all the doors and windows. We had already made him aware of the situation. He had seen the guy sitting in front of the house on several occasions, but he shrugged it off. I needed to get out for a bit because I was feeling trapped. It was a great night, and for a while, I was able to forget it all. Upon returning to the house, much to my relief, the front door was still locked. I walked into the house through the back door, and it too was locked. Our roommate was sound asleep in his room. I breathed a sigh of relief and made my way to the bedroom. As I walked into the room, I noticed my husband was reading something, and he was white as a sheet. I asked him what was wrong, and he handed me the sheet of paper and told me it was under my pillow. Then he got up and started looking in the closets and under the bed. He then went through the entire house while I read in horror. The letter said,
Hello, sexy. Nice house. I love the smell of your pillow. I hope you don't mind that I borrowed a few of your things. I'll return them when I've added my own scent to them. Don't bother contacting the police. I know when your mother is home alone. I know your roommate's schedule, and I also know your husband's. By the way, your roommate is a very sound sleeper. I'll be seeing you soon.
I called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do since he was no longer in the house, and I could not prove it was him because he never signed the note. I still could not figure out how he had gotten in. Another few weeks went by, and I realized that I was seeing him everywhere. At the grocery store, the pharmacy. He was everywhere, there lurking in the distance. It had gotten to the point where I was now on medication to help me sleep, and antidepressants because I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't function because the cops kept saying that they could do nothing about it unless he harmed me or was caught in my home. Sitting in front of it for hours on end in the alley is not illegal. This went on for over a year. I work a professional job and maintained my bubbly outward appearance in public, but hid like a timid little mouse behind closed doors at night. I was too afraid to leave my house. One night about 6 months ago, my husband and I awoke to flashing lights and people hollering outside. I discovered they were right outside. They had some guy on the ground, and they were ordering him not to move. The fire department was there, putting out a large 15-gallon gas can that had been lit on fire and placed on my front step. We threw on our robes, and rushed outside, where we were met by several police officers. They had the biker guy on the ground, in cuffs. One of the officers informed me that the neighbors across the street called, reporting a suspicious character lurking in front of my house, and he was carrying what seemed to be a large gas can. The officer also pointed out that all the tires on my car had been slashed. He went on to explain that the biker dude had placed the gas can on my front step and lit it on fire. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest, I thought I was going to literally die of a massive heart attack. I lost it and broke down sobbing. My husband, on the other hand, blew up. He was beyond angry. I was too, but I was too overwhelmed with the fact that had our neighbors not been up and called the police, then we could have been killed. Biker dude is now behind bars, but was only sentenced to 2 years on a plea deal. The scariest thing is that the police nor the state are required to notify me in the event that the creep is released. This is something that happened to me in the summer of 2018. I was 16 years old at the time. The small town that I called home was a quiet place where everyone knew each other. I lived near the town's center with my parents and my little brother. It was summer vacation, so I didn't have school. One of my friends, Jay, lived way out of town. It was about an hour walk each way, and I would often go over there and then walk back late at night, or sometimes I would stay over. I was over there on a Tuesday night. It was just me and Jay, because his parents were away for the evening. We had a good time, just hanging out in his backyard, where he had a fire pit and a hot tub. I didn't want to go, but as the midnight hour approached, I knew it was time for me to make my long journey back home. I told my parents I would be back that night. I said goodbye to Jay and headed out on my way back. The area was really safe, and I had made that trip many times before, so I wasn't scared at all. The road home stretched out before me, a solitary path flanked by vast fields of wheat swaying in the gentle breeze. The moon was full that night, so there was a lot of light considering the late hour. I could see at least a few hundred feet ahead of me on the road. There was not a car in sight, though. I was very alone. I trudged down the road. The crunch of gravel beneath my feet was the only sound that I could hear. The eerie silence seemed to amplify the sound of my own heartbeat, quickening with each passing step. As I continued my journey, my eyes caught sight of a figure in the distance, a man walking towards me. At first, there was nothing really alarming about his presence. I was curious, though. It was rare for me to see someone else on these roads at night, and I didn't know who it could be. Jay was an only child, and there were only a few other houses for miles. The figure got closer with each step, and I became more and more nervous. I didn't know if I should hide, or just continue on. While I was making up my mind, I noticed the figure had disappeared. I thought for a moment that I might have imagined it, but I was really sure that I saw someone. There was only one place that he could have gone, and that was into the wheat field. I stopped in my tracks, too scared to walk any further. There was someone hiding up ahead, and I didn't know what he wanted. There was no way I was walking past that point. I did the only thing I could do, and that was to head back to Jay's house. I turned around and started walking quickly back in the other direction. I looked over my shoulder every few seconds, but didn't see anybody behind me. I started to think that I had overreacted. Maybe whoever it was just scared of me and decided to hide. I would later find out that that was not true, though. I made it back to Jay's house and banged on the door. It took a few minutes for him to answer. I'm sure he was scared at first. I tried calling ahead, but Jay must have turned off his phone for the night. When I got there, I plugged my phone in and called my parents. They came to pick me up. On my way home, we saw a truck that we didn't recognize. Like I said, we lived in a small community, and there were not really any strangers, so it was weird to see that. We made it home, and didn't worry about it though. The scariest thing happened the next day. That's when I found out that there were several robberies in the area, including Jay's nearest neighbor. I'm pretty sure that figure I saw was involved, and the truck probably was too. I still don't know what they would have done if I'd continued walking that night. Perhaps the man hid because he didn't want me to see him, or maybe he was planning to ambush me. I may never know for sure, but I'm glad that I turned around when I did. It could have been a really bad mistake. I'm a 16-year-old guy who lives in the United States. The story takes place a few months after I got my driver's license. The town I live in is quite small, only having a family-owned grocery store, a McDonald's, and a Subway. Because of this, my friends and I would often venture into the surrounding towns for entertainment. The other town wasn't enormous either, but was decently sized, and it had a Walmart as well as access to an expressway. My friends and I got bored one day and decided to take the 10-minute drive to Walmart and screw around inside. It was me and 3 of my close friends. We were back in the wilderness section looking at the fishing poles. To the right of the fishing poles was a couple of hatchet kits for survival. We paid no mind to them as we messed around. We noticed a man and his wife walk up and look at the hatchets. They were about 10 feet down from us, but we didn't pay them any mind. As we were standing there, the man looked over at us and muttered,
"You think I could kill someone and chop up the body with this bad boy?"
Then he pointed towards one of the hatchets. We all kind of looked at each other before I spoke up and said, "Absolutely." I assumed it was some sort of joke, and he didn't have a good sense of humor. I was just playing along, hoping for a laugh and then for him to move on. He smiled back at me, but not genuinely. It was almost like a smile of anger, which confused me. His teeth were decaying. It was then that I noticed that the man didn't seem very well kept. I glanced over at his wife to see her eyeing one of my friends, who we'll call Antonio. My other 2 friends, who we'll call Jake and Hunter, started walking away after realizing how creepy his smile was. I followed them. When we got further away, Antonio said to me, "What was that?" Then we all laughed. Eventually we left the store and spotted the couple driving in the parking lot. Before we left, Antonio said he had to go to the bathroom. Hunter tagged along because apparently he had to go as well. Me and Jake were sitting at one of those tables in the Subway that was inside the Walmart. We were scrolling through our phones, waiting for our friends to finish. 2 minutes later, they returned, and then we all headed out of the Walmart. We saw the couple from earlier still circling the parking lot in an old beat-up Ford F-150. We stepped back inside before the truck spotted us. We let it past the entrance before sprinting to my Jeep that was luckily parked close. We hurried out of the parking lot, but not too dangerously, just going slightly fast. We heard the F-150 come barreling towards us from behind. We all snapped our heads around to see the thing going at least 30 or 40 miles per hour in the parking lot, before slamming on the brakes just behind us. Hunter leaned out my back window and flipped them off, and then we sped out of there. Then we got to the expressway, and eventually lost the couple. I don't know if they were just playing some sort of weird joke on us, but none of us found it funny. This is an older one, and certainly a memory that I've tried for decades to forget. Due to my father's work, we were constantly chasing after his jobs, sometimes spending only a few months in a single location. After my father got a new job in a small town, we moved into a rather nice house on a dead-end road. It was a large house with wood floors and a generally exceptional feel about it. Glad to have found a nice house in our price range, we didn't really think too much about why it was empty and why the landlords were willing to rent it out for such a low price. It would take a few months before we found out for ourselves what was going on. The haunting started as just a feeling that we kids would get from time to time. At first it was just a general sense of unease, but it quickly escalated. As time went on, we slowly transformed from simply thinking we were being watched to seeing forms in the corner of our eyes. The feeling of being watched had spread into the night at this point, and few of us were able to get a full night's rest. This continued on until we began to see things much closer, forefront in our vision. We had started seeing dark forms in the night, scaring us to the point where we'd all sleep in the same bed, just for a weak sense of security. Then we found the reason for the haunting. My brother and I were cleaning up an old closet that we had simply dumped a bunch of our toys into after we moved in. The bottom of it had a small wall, making it into somewhat of a built-in toy chest. We finally had some boxes to hold our toys, so we no longer needed to leave them in the closet. When we pulled our things out, we noticed that the carpet was loose. We were kids, so as such, we were not very smart. Instead of telling our parents, we just pulled the carpet back, revealing something none of us would ever forget. It was a tombstone. It was right there, with a name and dates already carved into it. Thinking there was someone buried in our closet, we quickly showed it to our parents. Thankfully, they decided to remove it from the house, and that was that, or so we thought. But the haunting didn't stop. We started to have nightmares and sick spells whenever we were alone in the house. All I knew was fear when I was in that place. I would awake at all hours in the night to see a dark figure standing over me, watching me sleep. I would cover my head with my sheets and pray to God to protect me. Usually it worked, but sometimes I would lower the sheet to see the dark ghostly face now staring me in the eye. Its face was only inches from my own. Soon we were all seeing faces in the dark, and we stopped doing things on our own during the night. We would share beds, and we would never get up to do anything on our own. We would often wake up whoever we were sleeping with to go to the bathroom or get a drink of water. The final straw happened one night. I was foolishly walking around the house late during a lightning storm. As I walked into my room, lightning flashed at just the right moment, and I saw a figure under my bed, staring at me with a grin that literally ran from ear to ear. Its needle-like teeth bared for me to see. I screamed in absolute terror, and it would take days for me to be willing to even play in my room. We removed the bed frames and started sleeping on our mattresses on the floor for protection from whatever I saw, but the nightmares and sightings would continue. Thankfully, my father's job forced us to move to a new location, and we were able to leave that house. In just 6 months, we went from happy to have such a nice home to wanting nothing more than to leave it behind. I'll never forget that horror, and it has left permanent scars on my soul. Even to this day, over 25 years later, I still have nightmares. God only knows what monsters were living in there with us. Just writing this has left my heart pounding with fear from that memory. I live in Alabama, in a rural yet woodsy neighborhood in a small town. I was 17 at the time this took place, which was around 2 years ago. I was at home one night bored, hanging around with my little brother, who was 14 at the time. We were playing Pokemon Go. It was about midnight at the time, and we played for a couple hours. We were geeking out over it, because we both used to play Pokemon on our Game Boys. We loved it as kids. At around 2 or 3 a.m., we decided to go out and play the game. We wanted to walk around the neighborhood, looking for Pokemon. Where we live is usually a pretty quiet, peaceful neighborhood, without much ever going on. There might be the occasional neighbor walking their dog, or even neighbors yelling, but nothing to ever worry about. We headed out of our house and walked down the driveway, which is pretty long. It was about a quarter mile. Then we went down the road. The neighborhood itself is like a giant U, and from beginning to the farthest point is about 5 miles in total. It's really spread out and simple. While walking, we were having the best time ever, just making random small talk and feeling like rebels for leaving our house so late, especially since we were basically sheltered as kids. We both caught a lot of Pokemon and reached about 3 miles into the backwoods area of our neighborhood. Eventually, our enthusiasm for Pokemon hunting waned, and we decided to head back home. On the way back, we felt completely safe and fearless. We felt that nothing could bother us in our quiet little area. As usual, there were no cars whatsoever out driving that late. I don't really know when, but when we were about 5 houses, or maybe what people would consider 1 block away from home. That's when we saw a car coming from the back of our neighborhood, down the really long road. We thought nothing of it at first, that is until it reached us. When it was close, it slowed down a lot, and almost came to a stop about 2 feet behind us. We were slowly walking along the side of the road, when I realized this was pretty strange. I felt very scared all of a sudden. The car followed us for maybe about 50 feet, which might have been 2 or 3 minutes. When I whispered something to my brother, I can't remember what, but probably something like this. You understand how this looks, don't you? I glanced over to my left. There was a house with a lot of trees surrounding the front lawn. At that moment, we both had the same idea. Right when we both saw it click in each other's eyes, we bolted up the hill, into the yard, and into the trees. When we got there, the trees blocked our view from the street. We always thought we were stealthy and tactile, but this situation showed us how vulnerable we really were. When we reached a point where we knew they couldn't see us anymore, we went on the ground on our stomachs. We watched the road from there, and in between some trees. We watched as this car was stopped in the middle of the road for a couple minutes. What he, she, or they might be wanting or doing was unknown to us, but we were pretty sure that they were up to no good. They started off again, from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. The engine was roaring like that of a muscle car. The tires slightly squealed. They were gone just like that. Me and my brother waited laying there for what seemed like forever, because we were a ways away from home and we didn't want to be seen. We had no idea what they wanted or what could have happened if we continued walking down the street and paid them no attention. Both of us were visibly shaken. We never said much of anything to each other during those moments either. I'm just glad we were both quick on our feet. We did get up and ran around the back of some houses, all the way back to ours. We burst in the door, locked it, and turned off all the lights, and we went straight to our mom. She happened to be awake and scolded us for going out so late and getting ourselves possibly abducted or worse. We watched out our front windows from the house, expecting to see them again, and sure enough, we did. They passed by the front of our house 3 times until we just never saw them again. Still to this day, I've never seen the same car again. Call it luck, being blessed, or whatever. All I can tell you is this. We possibly made it away from a confused person, seeing 2 kids out that late, walking the long roads. Otherwise, we made it away from a real threat, someone who decided to follow 2 kids and drive away quickly. It seemed like they knew they were busted or outplayed. After thinking it over, I was determined they spotted and followed us from the deep part of our neighborhood. It creeps me out to this day to think about it. Please, stay inside at night. Don't put yourself into a situation that could end up badly for yourself or others with you. Stay alert, watch your surroundings. Be safe, people. This story happened around 2 years ago. We had been entering an abandoned flour mill and factory for about 3 years. This is when we were 14 or 15. My mates and I began going through the 2nd floor window, and at the time, it was winter, meaning everything was freezing and completely icy. We went in the window to avoid being seen by security cameras. One night, when we were in there, we were just sitting down in room 5, fooling around, which I don't advise. When we were there, in the little hallway to the room, there were 3 consecutive loud bangs. At this point, we were on the 2nd floor, and there was no way someone could reach the windows without some way to climb up. When we realized it was inside, we all shot down to the floor to stay hidden. A man began screaming, almost in rhythm. He was saying, "I know you're in here." We were scared, and after 10 minutes, which felt like 10 hours, we started thinking that we needed to get out. We saw a flashlight in the opposite room. Realizing he couldn't see us without the light, we started sneaking over towards the door to get out. It was at that moment that another voice shouted,
Have you found them yet?
The man replied no. We then realized that the only way we could get out would be to jump out the window onto one of the old sheds in the yard. We turned around and started heading to the window. Now you're probably thinking, why didn't you go that way first? That's because there's a good 2-meter gap to the shed from the building, and it could collapse on us when we land on it. We tried to open the window, but it was stuck. My friend Nat said sorry, then he put his arm through the window. At that moment, the man had seen us, and we got lit up. We all turned around and saw a clown. We were terrified, and got out of that window in no time. Nat and I landed on top of the shed. My other mate Cal was about to jump, but the clown grabbed him. He physically got hold and wouldn't let go. Cal headbutted him and kicked him, struggling to get out the window just in time. We got down from the shed and bolted out of the yard. As we were running, we saw not 2, but 3 lights, all in separate windows. We were all running towards the exit, outside of the yard. It was terrifying, but we ran out of that yard. There was a little gate, which we climbed up to get to the window that we usually used. Me and Cal wasted no time in slamming into that gate, and then another clown popped out of the window and began laughing at us as we ran out of the building. We don't go back to that place at night anymore, or without at least 6 of us together. A little backstory about myself. I'm a 29-year-old Colombian female. Being born and raised in Colombia, I had my share of dangerous and scary experiences. The first one I can think of is this one. The story that my mom told me once I was old enough to cope with it. She's a fairly religious woman. We all are, after all. We're Catholic, to the core. She was born in this tiny rural town, deep in the Colombian plains. This deserted part of the country is famous for cattle raising, coke plants, harvesting, and guerrilla encounters with the military and paramilitary groups. Needless to say, it's a rough place to grow up, especially for a small female like my mom was. They were a rather poor family. My grandfather worked as a jeep driver, instead of cabs since there were no concrete roads. He worked from dusk until dawn, but not nearly making as much as he needed to support his rather large family. My grandmother took care of the kids, 5 in total, 2 girls and 3 boys. She made ice cream and other stuff to sell around the town. My mom grew up pretty much on her own. My grandmother was a very moody woman and did not show emotion or love towards anyone, ever. They used to go to church every Sunday, for this is pretty much the only thing you do around these places. One day, my mom was being a little difficult. She was only 6, but she remembers going to church and then making a scene at the end, because she did not get a treat at the town plaza. My grandmother, being the short-fused woman that she was, told her to stop it, or else she would be taken by the devil for being a bad girl. This was a very common threat back then, in such a religious society. She neither stopped, nor gave any mind to what her mother was saying. Then she saw him. He was a rather tall man, dressed really well. He was staring at them from the other side of the plaza. People were walking in front of him hastily, as others walked around. No one seemed to notice him. My mom stopped crying, and the man just smiled and waved, slowly and candidly. My mom just stared and waved back. She was 6 years old after all. She didn't know what else to do. My grandmother was just glad she had finally shut up, so she took her home, almost dragging her down the road. That night, when they had all gone to bed, my mom woke up to the sound of a tiny chick. She loved animals, and she was very used to them. Living in such a rural town as she did, it was common to see them around. She thought maybe she could catch it and keep it, so she woke up, put on her flip-flops, and slowly started to chase the sound of the tiny chick, not seeing it, but hearing it all the time. She slowly started walking towards the back of the house. In Colombia, people are very poor, and houses usually don't have walls at the back, so you can literally just walk right out. That's what she did. It was pitch black, but she knew how to handle herself in the dark. Also, she was a pretty fierce little girl, always playing rough with the boys and scratching her knees. She walked out of the backyard. She passed the giant mango tree that was the limit of her house. The chick sounded so near, she just had to catch it. She did not see the chick though, but just kept walking in the dark, trying to reach it. Sometimes it sounded really close, like right next to her, but sometimes it kind of faded out, as if the chick was a mile away. This kept on for a while, until she found herself in a place she hadn't seen before. She knew her town, and she knew she was lost. She stood in the middle of a tiny hill, glancing around. She thought that maybe she could see her house from there, but she didn't. Then she heard it again. The chick was so far away. The sound was almost unintelligible, and then a voice.
"Glad to see you again, little Pat. We've been waiting for you."
She turned around to see the same man from the plaza. His eyes glared in the moonlight. The same warm smile, and black hat, black coat, black vest, and black pants. Next to him, there was a lady she knew well, Mrs. Lopez, from the crooked street next to the military base. She looked pretty much as always, just sitting there in her Sunday dress, black as the night itself. She also had a black lace veil on the back of her hair. Her hands were crossed on her lap. They were both sitting on a fallen log, a huge log that was kind of decomposing. My mom saw worms crawling out and insects moving all around it. She then realized the smell. It stunk of rotten meat, rotten eggs, and bad breath, all at the same time. She felt like throwing up. She gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. It was then that she tried to scream. The scream did not come out, but the man started laughing. It was a surprisingly warm laugh, kind of like leaves crunching under your feet. It wasn't menacing, so she took her hands off her mouth. He then looked at her candidly and said,
"Your mom told me to come for you. Don't be afraid. We're gonna have a great time."
He then stood up, and that's when horror hit her. Then Mrs. Lopez stood up and opened her mouth. She heard the chick again. This time it was very far away, but coming from her mouth for sure. She took off running, the way she thought she had come from, screaming bloody murder and crying. She never looked back, but she kept hearing the chick, sometimes far, sometimes close, sometimes so close it made her run even faster. She then saw a light flickering through the field. The scarce trees let her see through, and she recognized the shape of my grandfather's broad shoulders. His flashlight moved around in front of her. She screamed at him, and stood up looking around until she finally reached and hugged him. My grandfather just stood there, holding his little girl, until she stopped crying. Then she told him about the man and Mrs. Lopez. He brushed it off, saying she had a nightmare and not to worry. She insisted it was real, but she was instead harshly disciplined for sneaking out in the middle of the night. Dawn came, and my grandmother sat at the kitchen table and called her up. She knew she was in for it, so she was preparing for the worst. But surprisingly, her mother didn't have a belt or anything in her hands. She was just sitting there, looking concerned, and asked her to sit. My mom complied, and then she asked what happened last night. My mom told her everything, from the moment she heard the chick until she saw my grandfather. My grandmother just listened wide-eyed, twisting her fingers and cracking her knuckles. When my mom stopped, she told her what happened. She apologized for calling her a bad girl, and threatening to give her away to the devil. She then started crying and saying she didn't know any better. She had been raised that way as well, and that's the only way she knew how to deal with her children. My mom was confused. Why was she apologizing? She then promised her nothing would happen to her, but she needed to behave better, and never ever leave the house without her knowing again. When I was growing up, my neighborhood was seen as very safe. That is until this incident. I'm from a small town in the Midwest of the United States. There was a single grocery store, a post office, and a school, etc. There was also a bus station. The train station was in the next town over, about a 45-minute drive. My dad ran a landscaping company, making him one of the few people in our town who was not involved in agriculture. Our house was a large 2-story place on the corner lot of one of the main residential streets. I had 2 younger brothers and an older sister, and there was still plenty of space for the whole family. That being said, we were still around average income for the area. It was a nice town, where everyone pretty much had everything they needed. Therefore, there was not much reason for crime in the area. Recently, however, there were several break-ins reported in the community. None of our direct neighbors, but it was still pretty creepy. The weird thing, though, is that nothing was ever really taken, nothing valuable anyway. Some people reported having various clothing items taken. Really, that makes it more creepy than if it was simply for money. I was in the 11th grade, at the only high school in town. My best friends were Casey and James, and one day, we were sitting in the cafeteria at lunchtime. James was telling us about one of the break-ins. One of them happened only 2 houses down from him, and he told us that he saw a broken window with blood dripping down the glass while the police were there. We all thought he was exaggerating, but we were still kind of scared. No one had any idea who was behind it all. It was like a dark cloud looming over our community. On Friday night, I was hanging out at Casey's place with James and a few other friends. We were in his backyard around the fire pit, just telling some scary stories and stuff. Eventually, we started to speculate on who could be behind the break-ins. I thought it was some high school kids. There were a few cliques of troublemakers in our school, and I thought they fit the bill. Casey thought it was some outsider who came into our town and was hiding out somewhere. That didn't make any sense to me, because there was really nowhere for a creep to stay in town without being noticed. It also seemed like a lot of effort to break into a few houses and not really take anything. We were at a loss. None of us could explain it. At around midnight, everyone started to leave. Casey lived about 2 or 3 miles out of the main area of our town, where my house was. I rode my bike though, so it only took me around 20 minutes to get home. As I was riding, there were fields on either side, with houses sparsely dotted between. On my way, I noticed something strange. There was a pickup truck parked in the road ahead of me. As I passed it, I looked in, but it was empty. I don't know who it belonged to, because everyone had a similar truck. There was a house nearby, belonging to Mrs. Foster, one of the teachers at my school. She would have no reason to park on the road, though, because there was plenty of space around her house. I was curious, so I turned off the front and back lights of my bike and crouched down about 100 feet in front of the truck. It was a dark night, and I was sure that I was hidden from sight. I sat there for about 15 minutes, and then the truck's lights came to life. The bright glow lit up a man who was approaching the vehicle. I recognized him. It was a man named Victor. He lived only a few houses down from me. He had a family with 2 daughters. Both of them went to my school. As the truck began to move, I realized that he was going to see me. It was a stupid mistake for me to hide in front of him instead of behind. I still didn't know what he was doing there. Obviously, I thought he might be the burglar, but I didn't know for sure. I got back on my bike and started pedaling. As the truck came up beside me and passed, I felt relieved. That would be short-lived though, because it pulled in front of me and blocked the entire road. He trapped me. If I turned around, then he could do the same thing in the other direction. In an instant, I made the decision to turn off the road into the field. It was a mostly empty field at that time of year, so I was able to move easily. It was almost pitch dark though, so I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't turn on my light, otherwise I'd be seen. As I made my way through the field, I could see the truck's bright lights. I used them to guide me. I just needed to get past that truck, and then I could get away. I quietly slipped back onto the road. He didn't see me. When I got home, I woke up my parents and told them what happened to me. To my relief, they believed every word. We called the police right then and there. After we reported the incident, I was kicking myself for not taking a picture of the truck and its license plate. I was disappointed that Victor was never arrested. Mrs. Foster never reported a break-in, so there was not much to go on. One thing I can say, though, is that after this incident, no more break-ins were ever reported. I think Victor was behind it, but I was never able to prove it. I think he got spooked by what happened that night. It was a really awkward situation in our town after that. Some people believed me, and others didn't. I moved away soon after, and I only go back on rare occasions. I used to live in a large apartment complex in a small town. I almost never saw the police around there. They were never needed. The story's about the time when all that changed. I say it was a large complex, but it was only large compared to anything else in the area. There were just 3 5-story buildings. It was right near the lake, and there were many houses in the surrounding area as well. It was a really nice spot, so even though it was a small town, there were a lot of people in that specific area. Some of the houses were really fancy, probably multi-million-dollar homes. Compare that to the tiny bachelor apartment that I lived in at the time. There was also one house right on the water that was converted into a retirement home. Not a bad place to be in long-term care. I would sometimes see the old ladies going for walks in the area and by the water. We would stop and chat sometimes, but sometimes they just kept to themselves. The lake was to the south, and in all other directions, there were houses. If you went further away from the lake, then you would get to the main street of our town, where we had some businesses and restaurants. The people from the retirement home usually wouldn't walk that far. It was nicer by the lake anyway. Like I said, it was such a safe place that the police didn't come by often. That's why I was so surprised one day to see the road by the lake was packed with more police cars than I'd ever seen in my life. There were at least 10 of them parked on the road surrounding my apartment building. Not only that, but there were more of them patrolling the area. I was too scared to ask what was going on. I guess I thought I would look like a suspect or something if I did. I was heading back to my apartment when an officer approached me. He explained that a woman had gone missing from the old age home. He showed me a picture of her and asked if I had seen her. I didn't recognize the woman at all, and I had never seen her in the area. I figured she must have been new to the home, because I would recognize most of them. I parted ways with the officer and went home, hoping they would find the missing person. In the coming days, the police presence decreased. I kept seeing posters for the missing woman, though. They were all over the place. Every day there would be a few police cars in the area, looking for the woman, I assumed. The really disturbing part was that if she had wandered into one of the yards of the houses, or into town, there's no doubt she would have been found quickly. The old age home being on the lake, there's really only one place a missing person could hide for that amount of time. About 2 weeks later, I heard on the news that a body had washed ashore from the lake about 10 miles away. I never looked at the lake the same way again. I grew up in the 1970s. I'm from a small town in North Carolina. In fact, it's almost too small to be called a town at all. It only had a school and a couple of small shops. I'm guessing you can imagine how boring it would be to be a teenager there, and it would have been if it wasn't for the woods. The neighborhood where I lived backed onto a big forest that spread out for 3 miles. I spent most of my teenage years there with my 2 best friends Levi and Connor. They were both in my class at school, and we were all 15. Levi lived across the street. He was smart and kind of quiet, unlike Connor, who lived down on the bad side of the neighborhood. Connor was a troublemaker. He would get sent to the dean's office at least once a week. He was loud, obnoxious, and a natural leader, always finding something for us to do. Because of that, when he was around, we were never bored. Connor had black, shaggy hair and the most beautiful eyes. One was light blue, and the other was a brownish color. He always wore scruffy red Converse shoes and a denim jacket, and of course, I had the biggest crush on him. Levi, on the other hand, had styled brown hair, brown eyes, and freckles. Then there was me, a red-headed, brown-eyed girl who quite a lot of people were scared of due to my hyperness. I was always ready to go somewhere or do something, and I was always talking about something. It was the beginning of summer holidays, and Levi had called me. We went down to get Connor, who was messing around with his younger brother's scooter in the front yard, and we asked him if he wanted to go to the woods. He said yes, so we made our way to the woods and started walking in a random direction. We did this for fun, because it meant we would usually get lost and have to find our way back. Most of the time, that just meant we'd be late for dinner and get sent to bed early, but we did it anyway. We were making our way along a deer trail that I don't think we'd ever been on before. Connor found a pile of poo, and of course dipped a stick into it and began chasing us around. Levi and I freaked out and scattered. Neither of us wanted to be smeared with it. I ran off, and lucky for me, Connor followed Levi in the opposite direction. After a while, they didn't come back, and I began to think that they had left me. I was starting to get worried. I was walking down the way I had seen them run, and suddenly, something shot out of the bush and grabbed me. I let out a surprised yelp. I soon realized that it was Connor, and he shushed me. Then I shouted at him for scaring me. Only when I saw the serious look on his face, I decided that I shouldn't be talking, and I shut my mouth. Connor whispered to me, "You have to see this." Then he began to lead me through the bushes. I soon noticed a foul odor in the air. The further we went, the stronger the smell became. Finally, we came upon a green clearing in the woods. Levi was staring at the ground with a weird expression on his face. I was about to ask him what was wrong, but Connor tugged me past him, a few feet away to where there was a ditch. In that ditch was what I could only describe as something out of a nightmare. It was a body. A purple and blue swollen mess of a body. The stench was now terrible, and I had to cover my mouth with my jumper in order to avoid getting sick. I backed up to where Levi was. Connor stood looking into the trench for about 5 more seconds before he walked back over to us. "Cool, huh?" he said with a grin. Levi gave him a disgusted look before saying, "No, it ain't cool. We need to go home and call the police." "What? Why?" "What do you mean, why? There's a body dumped in the woods, Connor. She's clearly been murdered." "No, man. It's so cool. We can't go to the police. If we do, they'll just think we were the ones who killed her." "Why would they think it was us?" "Because that's what the police do, man," Connor said. "Don't be stupid, Connor. You can't stop me," Levi barked back. Then Connor said, "Man, if you get the police out here, it'll be on the news. Everyone will get questioned. They'll probably put a curfew out, and they'll ban us from going into the forest. There will be police everywhere, and summer will suck." I had just been quietly watching the argument take place, not really participating. However, Connor's last point got to me, and there was no way I was going to let my summer get ruined. "Connor's right," I said. "What? You're not serious?" Levi asked. "Levi, we have the whole summer left. Do you really want to spend it inside?" "Yeah, man. It's 2 against 1. Come on, don't do anything stupid," said Connor. Levi hung his head, then said, "Fine, but I'm not coming near this thing again." Connor let out a sigh of relief, and we made our way home listening to him talk about how it would be our secret. Well, the secret didn't last long, because by the end of the week, Connor had showed all the rest of our friends, and it was a miracle that nobody called the police. I guess that just shows how close everybody was. We were like one big family, and like most families, we had our secrets. The body remained there for the rest of the summer. According to Connor, there were only bones left. On the last week of summer vacation, we decided to have a big camp out with all our friends. There was me, Levi, Connor, Josh, a loudmouth boy with messy brown hair and blue eyes, Alice, a quiet girl with straight brown hair cut into a neat bob, Courtney, who I would describe as the only girl who I actually saw as a friend, probably because she was the only one who put up with my bratty attitude. She had long dark brown, almost black hair, with brown eyes and also freckles dotting her cheeks. Lastly, there was Kenny Stokes, the kid whose garden we were camping in. He had sandy blonde hair, brown eyes, and freckles. His dad owned the biggest garden, so of course we got to camp there as an added bonus. Kenny's garden backed onto the woods. Even though we had promised Kenny's mom that we wouldn't go into the woods after dark, we were planning to. Unfortunately, our plans were foiled by Mother Nature, because she had decided to make it rain. So all 7 of us piled into the biggest tent, which belonged to Courtney, and we played cards for about 2 hours. After a while, the rain stopped, and Kenny suggested that we go out into the woods. Then we all argued for a while about where we should go and what we should do. So far, breaking into the school and hanging out there was winning. That was until Connor said, "Why don't we go see the body?" That was it. Everyone put on their shoes and coats, and Kenny took his dollar store flashlight, and then we went off. Connor and Kenny led the way, but Kenny's flashlight was pretty crappy, and it didn't light the way very well. I don't believe we needed it anyway, because even though I hadn't been there in weeks, it was burned into my mind how to get there. On the way, we were talking about what it would look like now, and how creepy this all was. Then the conversation took a turn that it had never taken before. We began talking about who we thought the body was, and who murdered them. This scared me, because it made me see it for what it really was. A dead body of a murdered person, hidden by someone in the woods, and we never reported it. I brought this issue up to Connor, but he simply stated, "It's too late now. It's probably only bones left, and even if we did tell the police, we would get in trouble for holding off for so long." To this, I remained silent, and kept walking alongside Courtney and Levi, listening to Josh while he told Alice a story behind us. They soon went silent, though, as we came up to the ditch. Connor and Kenny stood there at the edge, shining the flashlight in. Kenny's jaw dropped. I asked what it was, and Connor shushed me, then beckoned the rest of us over with his finger. When I looked in, I saw what the rest of them freaked out about. In the ditch was something piled on top of the original body. It was wrapped in a yellow floral patterned bedsheet, and it was tied up with some sort of a string to stop the sheet from coming away. Everyone stood silent for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only a couple of seconds. Connor pulled his Stanley knife out of his pocket and descended into the ditch. Levi began to protest, but Connor turned and shushed him, then whispered for Kenny to shine the light on him. Kenny obeyed, then Connor cut some of the string and pulled at the sheet. He revealed the face of a young girl. She stared up at us with a dead glazed look in her eyes and a blank expression. I felt like I was going to be sick, and apparently so did Levi, because he began to gag violently as he turned away. I couldn't turn away no matter how hard I tried. I was mesmerized. Connor suddenly jumped back. A look of horror crossed his pale face as he began to scramble up the side of the ditch. Josh helped him up. "What happened? What was it?" Josh asked. "It's dry as a bone," Connor said. A feeling of absolute dread settled in my stomach when I realized what that meant. It had rained only an hour earlier. Everything was wet, and this body was dry, which meant that it had to have been put there recently. Everyone was silent, and there was a noise behind us across the ditch. My heart was in my throat as we turned around. Then Kenny pointed his flashlight at where the noise was coming from. Then, we heard a sudden click. Next came an extremely bright light illuminating us, and making the person holding the light impossible to see. Connor yelled, "Run," then grabbed me by the arm, and everyone sprinted. Whoever it was with the light sprinted as well, randomly illuminating trees and bushes. Then suddenly, it went off. I tried listening to hear whoever was behind us, but all I could hear was my pulse racing. Everything was beginning to go blurry as we crashed through the tree line and into Kenny's backyard. We were greeted by Kenny and Courtney. Levi stumbled in a couple seconds later, face streaked with tears of fear. Then he was followed by Josh. We huddled together, and everyone began blabbering about what was going on and who that person was. After a few minutes, Courtney spoke up. "Where's Alice?" she said. Everyone went silent and looked towards the woods in fear. After an uncomfortable silence, Levi finally said, "Kenny, go get your dad." Connor looked over to glare at Levi before turning to Kenny and barked, "No, Kenny, don't get your dad. Let's think about this, okay?" "What's there to think about?" Levi fired back. "He'll call the police, and do you think the police are going to believe us?" "We'll wait 5 minutes, and then we'll get your dad," Connor said. For some reason, 5 minutes soon turned into 15, and then Connor reluctantly turned around to us and let out a defeated sigh. Then he said, "Kenny, go get your dad, but tell him that we were playing tag and that she ran into the woods so she wouldn't get caught. Okay?" "Right," Kenny agreed. Kenny's dad was a terrifying man. He was 6 feet tall and built like a tank. He was also an ex-Marine. Kenny began pounding on his back door. This went on for about a minute before Mr. Stokes threw open the door, face red with fury.
"What are you playing at, boy? It's 2 in the morning," he hollered.
"Dad, Alice is in the woods."
"What?"
he asked. "She ran in when we were playing tag, and she hasn't come back out. I think she's lost." Mr. Stokes stared off into the woods for a bit, squinting, trying to see behind the tree line, before muttering an okay. Then he retreated into his house, only to return 5 minutes later with a big flashlight. He stomped into the woods, while we all waited for about 20 minutes before he returned, and said,
"Fun's over, kids. Go home and get your fathers, and tell them to bring flashlights."
And that was it. We all went home and told our parents what was going on, and they all came over to help look for Alice. We were all told to stay at home, but I couldn't do that. I crossed the street and knocked on Levi's door. He answered, and I stepped inside. Apparently Connor had the same idea, because he was sitting on the sofa in Levi's living room. "Do you think they'll find her?" I asked quietly. "Yeah, she probably just panicked and got herself lost," said Connor. "And what if he got her? What if she's dead? What are you going to do then?" said Levi, as he stood by the window looking into the dark street. "Then we keep our stories the same. She ran off into the woods and didn't come out. That's all you say," Connor said coldly. Suddenly the sound of police sirens cut through the air. "Oh no," mumbled Levi as the police cars drove down the road to Kenny's house. We watched as 2 police cars pulled up, and the men got out carrying big flashlights. They walked around back into the woods. After that, me and Connor went home, and I watched out my window as 5 more police cars appeared. My parents came home at around 6 in the morning. I asked my mother what happened, and she told me that they found a body in the woods, and it wasn't looking good. The next day, the police interviewed all of us, and we stuck to Connor's story. They didn't find Alice, and just like Connor said, there was news coverage and a ban on us going into the woods. There was also a curfew of 9 p.m., and when we went back to school, there was an assembly on safety with strangers. Alice was never found, and eventually, we moved on with our lives, horrible as it sounds. I now have children of my own, and I've since lost contact with all of my childhood friends, apart from Levi, who's the father of my children. He recently told me that Kenny had just died of an overdose, and we were invited to the funeral, along with the rest of the kids I grew up with. I will not be attending the funeral. I live in a boring little town in Florida. It's an uneventful place, so for fun, or maybe just out of pure boredom, my friend and I would meet up to go for late-night walks around our town. We usually met up across the street from these woods, right next to a small abandoned fire station. It was also just down the road from the only gas station in town. On this particular night, my friend wanted to explore this little path that cuts directly through the woods. It was about 1 a.m., and I thought it might be a cool adventure, so I agreed. We crossed the street and made it to the mouth of the trail. I should mention that there was construction going on to the left side of the woods, so it was fenced off. The lights from the site illuminated the trail, so we didn't really need flashlights. I had an uneasy feeling right off the bat, like we were being watched, but I chalked it up to nerves and an overactive imagination. We continued down the trail, and I started to notice weird things like branches breaking and leaves crunching just out of view. I told my friend that maybe we should leave. About 10 seconds later, the lights from the construction site shut off. The moon was pretty much full though, so I wasn't worried. It did make things a little more spooky though. We hadn't walked very far, and I could still make out the mouth of the trail. We decided to walk back, and I felt relieved. That's when I noticed it. Crouched down in the bush, not 5 feet away, was someone watching us. I told my friend to run, and we booked it, and I could hear the person was running after us. We kept running, and eventually made it out of the woods and crossed the street. I turned to look back, and I saw him right at the mouth of the trail. This dude was completely naked, and he looked insane. He had a glass bottle in his hand, and he threw it in our direction. Then he grabbed a rock and threw that as well. We made like trees and got the hell out of there. We didn't stop until we made it to the gas station. I noticed that my friend was bleeding pretty badly from his arm, and he told me that right before I grabbed him to run, something hit him. Upon further inspection, I noticed that he had a large piece of glass sticking out of his arm. He needed 15 stitches. We called the cops and explained what happened, partly because we didn't want anyone else to get hurt, and partly because we didn't feel safe with that guy running around. When the cops searched the woods that morning, they found signs that somebody had been living there, and more disturbingly, bloody clothes that looked like they belonged to a little girl. I haven't heard anything about it since. I'm a 31-year-old guy, and I live in a small town in Canada, but this took place almost 10 years ago. I'm a short drive away from Thunder Bay, Ontario, and when this happened, I was on a road trip alone to visit my brother, who lived about an 8-hour drive away. If you don't know the highways around there, there's a lot of forest and the occasional town where you can stop to eat or go to the bathroom. The roads are long, and there's not a lot going on. To make matters worse, there are a lot of drunk drivers if you stay out late. Because of that, I would always try not to drive after dark. Overall, it's a pretty boring drive, and I try to only do it a few times per year. I usually try to do it in one day, but this time, it was raining, and the roads were too dangerous to drive at full speed. I estimated the drive would take around 11 hours instead of the usual 8. Because of that, I figured I'd have to stop at some point and spend the night, especially if I wanted to avoid driving after dark. Although I had done the drive before, I didn't know the way well enough to choose a good place to stop. The information online was not very good either, so I didn't really know where I would stay. I had been on the road for around 6 hours, and it was getting dark. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the noise on my car was deafening. I could barely listen to music, it was so loud. I was keeping an eye out for a place to stop. A roadside motel would be best. There hadn't been much in the last hour, though, but I was seeing signs that indicated a town was coming up. Even though I'm from the area, every time I drive that way, there are towns I swear I've never heard of. This was one of them. When the time came, I turned off the highway and made my way into this small town. It was only 7 p.m., but on my first pass of this place, it was eerily quiet. There was a post office, a grocery store, and an LCBO. That's the liquor store in Ontario. I also saw a gas station that looked closed. I wasn't sure if it was out of business or if it was just closed for the night. I don't know of any gas stations that close at 7 p.m., so I suppose it was the former. One thing that I didn't see was a motel, or a hotel of any kind. I was really looking forward to a shower and a bed, but it was starting to look like that wouldn't happen. After I drove the empty streets another time, I was certain I would be sleeping in my car for the night. I did see a small diner that was open. Besides that, there were just some houses and a small apartment building. I went to the restaurant and ordered dinner. Then I nursed a beer until they kicked me out. By then, it was just past 10 o'clock. I made my way back to the closed gas station, because I thought that would be the best place for me to park for the night. By then, the rain had slowed down considerably, and I started seeing some people out on the streets. One of them was a single man walking down the sidewalk. He was wearing dark, baggy clothes, and seemed to walk with a limp. He had long, dark hair, and he was quite tall. I drove past him, and felt his glare as I did, but it was too dark to tell for sure if it was my imagination. When I got to the parking lot of the gas station, I parked in the far corner and reclined my seat. Although it was early in the evening, I was tired. After another 10 to 15 minutes, the rain picked up again. Large drops pelted my windshield, making quite a loud noise with each one. I actually found it quite soothing, so it didn't bother me. I laid back in my seat and tried to get some sleep. Not surprisingly, I didn't get to sleep right away. Though the rain was heavy, I noticed the faint sound of footsteps outside my car. I opened my eyes and saw what looked like a man walking past my car. I was surprised that anyone would be out there in the rain, but since I was technically trespassing, my first thought that it was the police, or maybe the owner of the gas station. I was ready to move along if needed, so I sat up and turned on my light. Just then, I heard a loud crash coming from the back of my car. I turned around, but all that I could see was that my back window was shattered. Then I heard the sound again. Someone was out there hacking away at my car. Since it was dark outside, I couldn't see who it was or how many of them there were. Whoever it was, they kept slamming my back window. I didn't know how long the shattered window would hold, so I fired up my engine and flicked on my headlights. Off in the distance, I saw a police car parked across the lot. His lights were off, and the driver's side window was open. A single officer sat there in the front seat, smoking a cigarette. He was watching my car with a bored look on his face. He was just sitting there watching as someone tried to smash into my car, and he didn't do a thing. My foot moved to the gas pedal, and I drove out of there. I tried looking in my rearview mirror to see my attacker, but the glass was way too messed up to see through. I thought at that point that there would be no sense in trying to sleep, so I decided to take my chances on the road and drive through the night. That way, I would get to my brother's early in the morning, and maybe I could take a nap. Obviously, I didn't bother calling the cops, because there was one right there, and he did nothing. The rain splashed beneath my tires as I sped away. Luckily, my back window was still intact, although it was badly shattered. After another half hour on the road, I saw flashing lights behind me. I was being pulled over. My car eased to the shoulder, and I brought it to a stop. I rolled down my window, and an officer approached. It was the same cop who watched me getting attacked earlier.
"Evening, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?"
He asked. "No, why?" I said, pretending I didn't recognize him.
"It's no big deal. One of your taillights is out. Just get it checked in the morning."
There was a strange tension between us as I sat there trying to understand what his angle was. He didn't say a word about my totally smashed back window. To this day, it was the creepiest and most awkward 2 minutes of my life. After that, the cop started to walk away. Against my better judgment, I called out to him. "Excuse me, sir. What's your badge number?" The officer walked back over to my window, put his hand on the roof of my car, and said,
"Don't push your luck."
Then he walked back to his car and drove back in the opposite direction. It was early morning by the time I got to my brother's town. When I pulled into his driveway, I finally had a chance to assess the damage to my car. Other than the back window, both of my taillights were smashed, and my license plate was missing. The cop didn't even bother to mention that. After days of thinking, I'm pretty sure it was a random act of violence. As for the cop, I'm pretty sure he was a real police officer. However, I filed a report with the OPP, but never found out who he was. To this day, I still can't explain why he followed me, only to give me a warning. I think he just wanted to rub it in on me. It was like some kind of a power move. All I know now is that whenever I'm on the road, I make sure to skip that town. I work as a contractor in a small town. Most of my work is renovating older houses, but I do all kinds of things including some basic landscaping and carpentry. Since it's a smaller community, I have to be kind of a jack of all trades, although I think I'm a master of a few as well. This story is about a client of mine who turned out to be a total psycho. My marketing budget was really low. I just had a basic website and a business page on Facebook. That was it. One morning, I was checking my messages before heading out to a job site. I got a new message from a guy named John, who lived in the next town over from me. His profile was minimal, just his name and the town where he lived. He said that he had some work to be done on his house, but he didn't give much detail up front. I replied and told him I could stop by after work that day. I finished work early and headed over to John's place. It was in one of the nicer neighborhoods I had seen in the area. John's house was a beautiful gray brick place with a wraparound porch and a long driveway. I drove my white pickup truck up to the front door and got out. I felt underdressed in my ragged work clothes. One knock on the door was all it took. A man swung the door open and stood in the doorway. He was about 50 years old, with a gray ponytail and glasses. The man introduced himself as John and gave me a little more detail on the work while leading me to the basement. He told me he wanted a reinforced room to use as an office. He wanted soundproofing and a security door. John told me that he had some important documents and equipment that was worth extra protection. The soundproofing was so that he could work in peace and quiet at all times. I thought that made sense. I got the impression that John was rich, so there's no telling what kind of important stuff he had. I had never done a project like that, but it seemed like it was within my skill set. When we got to the bottom of the stairs, John led me to a small room at the end of a long hallway. I would have thought it was meant to be a laundry room, or maybe storage. The room was narrow, and there were no windows. It seemed like a bad place for an office. I didn't know why anyone would want to spend any amount of time in that room, especially with such a beautiful house. There were many better places. I figured security was his main concern though, but it still seemed off. Once we were there, John stood in the doorway while I took some measurements. Since the room was small, it would be pretty easy for me to fit it into my schedule. It was probably a single-day project. I gave him a quick quote right there, and he readily accepted. I almost wished I'd asked for more. I went home that night and didn't think much of it. The next week, I had a day to spend on the project. I headed over to John's place and knocked on the front door. He answered the door and let me in. When I was in the basement working, John was upstairs in the house. After I installed the soundproofing and added a layer of plywood over it, the room took on an eerie vibe. It was looking more and more like a prison cell than an office. The layers of foam and wood made the room look even smaller. I was feeling claustrophobic being in there. It was then that I started to become really suspicious. I finished most of the work by 1 p.m., at which time John invited me upstairs for lunch. That was not usual in my experience, but much appreciated. I headed up and joined John at the kitchen table. Sitting across from him was uncomfortable. Something about this guy began to put me off. Up until then, our interactions had been purely business. Now I was having lunch with the guy, and I was seeing his personality. He was very cold, with a blank look in his eyes. I told John that I was almost done, and all I had to do was install the large steel door. After lunch, I went back down to the basement and finished up the work. By the time I was done, it was only 3:30 p.m. I was ready to call it a day, but then I heard someone walking down the stairs, and I saw John approaching from the hallway, and he had something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, because it was in a white plastic bag. He walked up to me and looked everything over.
Good job,
John said, seeming pleased.
There's one more thing I'd like you to do,
he added. Then he opened the bag and took out a new lock. It was a deadbolt lock. That made sense because there wasn't a deadbolt on the door. I took a closer look and noticed that it was a one-way lock, meaning you could only lock it from the outside. By then, I was getting really suspicious. I thought this guy was building a prison cell or some kind of dungeon in his house. There was no smoking gun, and I certainly couldn't prove it, but that was what I thought. Not wanting to do any more work for the guy, I made up an excuse not to install the lock. I told him that it didn't fit the door, or some BS like that. He seemed to buy it, so he paid me, and I left. When I got home, I googled John's name. I had his last name too. To my shock, I found a pretty concerning criminal record on him. Records like that are public where I live, so I was able to find out that he was convicted of several serious crimes, the most startling of which being kidnapping. With that knowledge, what I saw before seemed even more concerning. That was when I decided to report him to the police. I drove there that night and told the cops everything I knew. Obviously, it's not illegal to soundproof a room, but I thought it was worth it to watch the guy. They seemed to take it seriously because they knew who John was. They promised to look into it and keep an eye on him. I watched the news every once in a while to see if anything came up, but nothing has. As far as I know, John is still out there with a freaking prison cell in his basement. I pray that I was mistaken, but I think that guy was up to something bad. I had a property near a small town, but out in the country. There was a lot of space out there, and it was only one town over from where I grew up. I still had some friends and family there, so I was happy to make the move. Before then, I had a small apartment in the city, but my work let me go fully remote, so I didn't need to be there anymore at all. It was a small community that was still only an hour drive out of the city. The place was rather isolated. The nearest house to mine was really far away, and everyone in the community seemed to keep to themselves. One evening at around 6 p.m., I was sitting by my front window. There came a knock at my door, but I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the glass, I saw a man, a stranger, standing on my porch. I opened the door, not wanting to be unfriendly. The man claimed to be my neighbor. That was a surprise, since I thought I was the only one for miles around. We spoke for a few minutes. The guy had a really good personality, and we were hitting it off. At one point, he finally asked if he could come in. I almost said yes, but stopped myself at the last second. The guy had a strange urgency in his voice, and it put me off a little. I told him I was tired, and said maybe we could do it another time. He frowned, his features showing his impatience, but he nodded and turned away. I watched him walk back down the path, then he turned out of my sight. Once he was gone, I felt strange about the whole thing. It wasn't every day that somebody showed up unannounced in these parts. I locked the door, double-checked it, and drew the curtains. The night grew darker, and I tried to forget the man. I really wasn't sure what a neighbor was around there anyway. Maybe 10 miles away was considered a neighbor. As days passed, I forgot about the man. It had been about 2 weeks, and I hadn't seen him again. I did meet some of the other people in the area, but none of them looked anything like that guy. My nearest neighbor was a young family, and there was another single guy as well. I asked them both about the guy who came to my door, and neither had seen anyone who matched the description. After another week, I had still not seen him, but then one night something happened. I heard it from my bed upstairs. There was a faint scraping sound against my front door. I froze, and my heart started pounding really hard. There was again, a persistent and deliberate rattle. I didn't know what it was, but I feared the worst. A burglary out there was really terrifying, because it was far away from the police station. Panic seized me, and I tiptoed to the window, peering out into the darkness. It was hard to see anything. All I could see was trees and the looming shadows of the countryside. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of the intruder. The scraping grew louder, but I couldn't see anything from my bedroom window, especially in the dark. Whoever it was, they were determined. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. My first instinct was to call for help, but the signal was weak out there, and I couldn't make a call to any of my friends. I called 911 instead. When I spoke to the operator, he told me it would be at least 30 minutes. I whispered that it was an emergency, but that didn't change anything. I clenched my teeth, trying to think of another plan. I decided to creep to the back of my house, and I kept my steps as silent as I could. There, hidden in the corner, was a small toolbox, and I pulled out a heavy wrench. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Heart pounding, I approached the back door, my breath coming fast and shallow. The scraping had turned into a series of sharp thuds. They echoed through the silent house like thunder on a still night. I was shaking almost uncontrollably at this point, but I managed to get out to the back of my house. Summoning all my courage, I walked around my house and peeked out to the front porch. It was really dark, so I was not worried about being seen. One of my faint porch lights was on, though, so I could see the intruder. I stood there trembling, the wrench heavy in my hand. I scanned the area around my house, but there was no sign of any car or truck, just that single man trying to pry his way into my front door. I looked on helplessly, but I took some comfort in knowing that if he got in, I wouldn't be there. From that dark corner on the outside of my house, I watched as he finally broke my door down and disappeared into my house. It felt like hours since I'd called the cops, but when I looked at my phone, it had only been 20 minutes. I stayed out there in the darkness for several minutes, and eventually the cops showed up. They went into my house and brought the man out in handcuffs. His face was pointed down, and I couldn't tell what he looked like. He was placed into a police car and taken away. I talked to one of the cops after that. He asked me some questions that I wasn't expecting. They wanted to know if I had any stalkers that I knew about. Until then, I was under the impression that it was just a robbery. The officer then told me that the intruder was found in my bed, naked. There was no part of me that thought I was being stalked, or anything of the sort. Then I remembered the guy who came to my door weeks earlier. I told the officer about that, but also mentioned that I wasn't sure if it was him or not. To be honest, I might not even recognize the guy if I saw him, so I couldn't even pick him out of a lineup. I never found out if the two incidents were connected, but the guy was caught, and I never had another strange visitor come to my door, so take that for what you will. I'm happy enough that he's gone. I'm from a small town in Saskatchewan. It's near several reserves and is rife with crime, drugs, poverty, gang violence, and desperation. Anyone who knows the province even a little bit will know exactly what I mean. I've spent 21 of my 26 years there, the rest in Nova Scotia and Dawson Creek, BC. I've always had horrific things happening to and around me, but they never registered as the disturbing kind of stuff. I'm a storyteller by nature, and always just added them to my ever-expanding box of humorous anecdotes to tell at parties and social gatherings. As of late, people have suggested that I start sharing them, because one of them is apparently enough to give someone PTSD. People are amazed that I'm of sound mind and still able to function after all the crap I've seen. As a teenager, I was the type of kid most of us become, the middle-class white kid who spends his nights smoking dope and walking around making sarcastic comments about his surroundings with good friends. At the time, I was hanging out with this kid who I'll rename Gene for the sake of anonymity. This specific night, we'd gotten sick of playing Gears of War 2 and wanted to go for a walk. I was never a Gears of War guy. To me, violence is boring. I was raised on Nintendo, and at the time, I was a casual Sims player who spent most of his time writing short stories. Gene had spent the 12 hours before I came over playing Gears of War, so easy to say, by 11 p.m., we were both fed up. We had decided to check out which new games had been released at the store, which was about 2 kilometers from his house. That's 2 kilometers through the thicket of the town. Through the drug dealers' houses, homeless camps, and abandoned warehouses. Also through the areas where the goths, white supremacists, and emo kids would hang out, right into Desperation Avenue. It was that neighborhood where nobody lives unless they absolutely have to. We got to the GameStop about half an hour before closing and began browsing. It was so dark outside that looking through the store windows made it seem like we were in an oil pit, just thick, viscous blackness. I felt understandably uneasy from the start, and right before closing, my friend decided on some off-brand James Bond game for the original Xbox. I was glad to get out of there. When we left the store, we got into the light at the back side of the building. At that time, that was the last light that we'd see until we crossed over to the safer part of town. All of a sudden, we heard a native man sweetly talking to someone. We turned to our right to see a tall, muscular man with 2 slightly overweight henchmen standing at the front door to an apartment. His Glock was pressing down on the speaker box button. A woman could be heard on the speaker saying stuff like, "No, I ain't letting you in, babe. You probably got your goons outside." The man still had his gun pressing the button. His backups were hiding revolvers behind their backs. Then he said,
Come on, who do you think I am? I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to make it right.
His voice was both completely condescending and disgustingly playful. Disgustingly playful, like when you have a couple nearby doing baby talk to one another and you pray for someone to drug and drag you away. Then the woman started talking. She carried on, and as she did, the guy turned back to see us watching this unfold. Then he whistled. One of his goons saw us, and we darted through the park, past the public school, into Drug Dealer Alley, and across to the better side of town. When I hit the Catholic school, I was so relieved. I stopped to take a breath, laughing at what I just survived. Gene and I were separated at that point. Then while resting my hands on my knees, I tried to catch my breath. And I looked around trying to see if anybody might be lurking. I then proceeded through the alley and climbed the fence, falling into the backyard of Gene's mom's house. I then snuck in the back door. A few minutes later, as I creepily checked the house for Gene, something fell onto the back doorstep. I opened the curtains to see Gene, out of breath, laughing, and unscathed. I opened up and said, "Wow, that was a rush." Then he led me up to his room, where we watched some Afro Samurai for the rest of the night. I never found out what happened in this case, because how's a grade 12 student going to? I will say though, that a long time later, the entire block was under lockdown to track a scent that the police thought was a gas leak. However, it wound up being some poor woman who liquidized into her carpet. It was the middle of summer, and all they had left was a couple of skull bones and a giant puddle in the carpet of that same building. No one knows how long she had been there. I'm not saying the two incidents were related, but it is odd. After that, they issued 6 private security details watching the area at all times. Now I think we're down to 1.